When the Pacific War began in December 1941, the Japanese Imperial Army carried with them the memory of quick victories. Hong Kong fell in weeks. Singapore surrendered in humiliation. American troops, retreating from the Philippines, clung to the idea that reinforcements would come. But in the jungles, on the beaches, and across the skies of the Pacific, a new kind of war was emerging, one shaped not only by courage and endurance, but by sound. Among all the noises of battle, the mortar shells, the shrill cries, the metallic clatter of Arisaka rifles, there was one sound that became legend, a deep, unbroken roar that seemed less like a gun and more like an engine of death. The Browning .50 caliber machine gun, first designed by John Moses Browning in the waning days of the First World War, the M2 heavy machine gun was a weapon ahead of its time, chambered in a half-inch round that could tear through metal, wood, and flesh alike. By 1942, it was the heartbeat of American firepower, mounted on jeeps, tanks, bombers, and the wings of fighters like the P-51 Mustang and the F-4U Corsair. It was a weapon meant not only to kill, but to dominate the battlefield by presence alone. But for the men on the other side, for the Japanese soldiers crouched in caves, hiding in the shadows of palm trees, or running across black volcanic sand, it became something far worse, a sound that carried terror before it ever brought death. Archival reports from Guadalcanal describe it first. A Marine after-action report dated November 1942 notes, "Enemy soldiers halted their charge when the 50s opened up. The effect was immediate. Survivors refused to advance again. They called it the thunder weapon." The Marines who fought on those beaches came to depend on that thunder. When the Japanese banzai charges swept across open terrain, the Browning's deep mechanical rhythm would break the silence. Thud, 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 5 times per second. A sound that echoed across valleys and surf. For the Japanese infantry, trained for courage and indoctrinated in the belief that spirit could overcome steel, it was a shock. They had never faced a weapon that sounded like this, a weapon whose sound alone could strip away the illusion of invincibility. In a post-war interview, a former Imperial Army corporal, Mitsuo Yamane, remembered his first encounter with the weapon on Guadalcanal. "At first, I thought it was an engine. We were moving through the jungle at dawn when it began. The air shook, the ground too. I thought maybe American planes were strafing. But then I saw the trees falling one by one. The bullets were so large, they cut the branches like swords. We couldn't even see the Americans, only the sound." The Browning .50 was not subtle. Its presence on the battlefield changed tactics almost overnight. Japanese officers began ordering their men to dig deeper, to construct foxholes and earthen walls thicker than ever before. They learned that standing upright, even for a moment, could be fatal. The .50 could tear through palm trunks, coconut logs, and even the light armor of their Type 95 tanks. From a technical standpoint, it was a marvel. Each round left the barrel at nearly 900 meters per second, the heavy bullet punching through targets with an energy unmatched by any small arm in the Pacific theater. Yet the weapon's greatest power wasn't only its lethality. It was its psychological dominance. When American landing craft approached the beaches of Tarawa in 1943, their mounted Brownings opened up long before the Marines touched the sand. The air became a storm of sound. Japanese gunners later wrote that they could no longer distinguish between machine gun fire and the roar of the sea. The noise blurred into one endless wave of destruction. A Japanese diary recovered on Tarawa reads, "The American gunfire is not like ours. It roars like a dragon, never stopping. Even when it is far away, the sound sits in the chest. You feel it before you hear it." For many American soldiers, the weapon inspired a strange reverence. It wasn't just another tool of war, it was a guardian. Gunners named their Brownings Baby, Betty Lou, Uncle Sam's Roar. They cleaned them like altars, wrapping the long barrels in oil-soaked cloth and talking to them as if the weapon could hear. In training, Marines were taught to respect the gun's recoil, its temperamental feeding mechanism, its hunger for ammunition. In combat, though, there was only instinct. Pull the trigger and let the weapon speak. At Saipan, in June 1944, the Browning became the dividing line between survival and annihilation. American half-tracks and Sherman tanks mounted multiple M2s, firing in arcs that cut down charging infantry before they came within grenade range. Witnesses recalled Japanese soldiers screaming as the 50 rounds struck the sand around them, spraying up geysers of dust and blood. The sound traveled miles. Veterans later said that when the Browning fired in the night, its echo carried like thunder across the ocean. Back in Tokyo, captured American reports about this weapon circulated among Japanese officers. Some dismissed them as propaganda. Others, who had faced the gun firsthand, said nothing. The sound was enough to explain. As the war dragged on, rumors spread among Japanese ranks. Rumors that the Americans had developed a gun that could split the air, that its bullets were as large as a man's thumb, that its noise was the roar of the devil. In truth, it was just steel, powder, and design. But in war, fear magnifies everything. By 1945, the Browning 50 caliber had become more than a weapon. It was a psychological boundary. For the Japanese, the sound meant an unseen death was coming. For the Americans, it meant control, dominance over chaos. And in that sound, both sides heard something more profound than gunfire. They heard the new language of modern warfare, a language of noise, precision, and terror, where even the air could kill. By the middle of 1944, the Pacific War had become a brutal contest of endurance. The American island-hopping campaign was advancing relentlessly westward, from Tarawa to Saipan, from Guam to Peleliu. Each new battle fought on terrain more hostile, more fortified, more desperate. The Imperial Japanese Army no longer dreamed of victory. Their purpose had shifted to inflicting as much pain as possible before dying. Yet in every new invasion, one constant echoed through the smoke and chaos, the sound of the Browning 50 caliber. As American forces learned to synchronize their combined arms assaults, the 50 became the rhythm section of destruction. Mounted on landing craft, tanks, and aircraft, it filled every space with the same unmistakable roar. Thud, 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 the low-frequency pulse that preceded devastation. Reports from the Battle of Saipan, June 1944, described the Japanese soldiers' growing dread. A Marine lieutenant wrote in his field diary, "We could see them freeze when the 50s opened up. Some tried to crawl away, but most just pressed themselves into the dirt. They knew what was coming." Japanese units began to refer to the weapon in fearful nicknames. One intelligence intercept translated the phrase "Oni no Koe," the voice of the demon. Another called it "Kaminari no Kikanju," the thunder machine gun. These weren't exaggerations. Captured soldiers described hearing the weapon before the Americans were even visible. "It sounded like the sky was tearing apart," one prisoner recalled. "When the shooting started, you could feel the pressure in your chest, as if your own heart was afraid." The Americans noticed this too. Combat reports show that commanders began using the 50, not only for its firepower, but for its psychological effect. The sound alone could halt a counterattack or flush enemies from hiding. On Saipan, platoons were ordered to fire bursts into dense jungle before advancing, not necessarily to kill, but to intimidate. Marine Sergeant Alan Reese remembered, "We'd fire a few bursts from the half-track and listen. You could hear them running, branches breaking, panicked shouting. Sometimes they fired back blindly. But after the 50s spoke, they didn't stay around long. By this point, the Japanese had developed elaborate cave systems and tunnel networks, particularly on Saipan and later on Iwo Jima. They had learned that the only defense against the Browning was Earth itself, layers of soil and stone that might absorb the furious impact. Even so, the sound penetrated. Inside those caves, men trembled not only from heat and exhaustion, but from the rhythmic thunder echoing through the rock. One survivor of Iwo Jima, Corporal Satoru Okabe, recalled decades later, "We could not see the enemy. We only heard the gun, deep, constant, like drums in hell. Even when it stopped, the sound stayed in our heads. When silence returned, we feared it most, because we knew the next burst was coming." The psychological toll was immense. American intelligence officers, analyzing captured diaries, noted recurring phrases: "the gun that never sleeps," "the monster that eats the mountain," and "the roar that announces death." But the terror wasn't one-sided. For the American gunners, the 50 was both a shield and a burden. The weapon gave them dominance, but its recoil, its volume, its sheer violence could unnerve even those who used it. Corporal Charles Hanley, a Marine machine gunner at Iwo Jima, described it in a post-war interview. "The noise got into your bones. You'd fire for 10 seconds, and the whole vehicle would shake. Your teeth rattled, your vision blurred. It wasn't just loud, it was physical. You could feel death coming out of the barrel." The 50's report was unlike anything else on the battlefield. Lower than rifle fire, sharper than artillery, and infinitely more personal. It came from a man's hands, yet carried the destructive weight of a cannon. When the Americans landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945, every jeep, every tank, every landing craft seemed to carry one. Hundreds of Brownings roared in unison as Marines fought across the volcanic ash. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in Mount Suribachi and its tunnels, soon understood that no position was truly safe. A diary recovered from a dead officer, Lieutenant Takeo Fujita, captured the moment. "The American gunfire never stops. It crushes the stones above our heads. The air itself seems to break. Men cover their ears, but the sound goes through the bones. We cannot hear our own hearts." What had once been a weapon of tactical superiority had now become a symbol of psychological domination. The U.S. military had, perhaps unknowingly, discovered acoustic warfare, the use of sound itself as a weapon of control. In the open fields of Okinawa, that control reached its peak. By April 1945, American forces deployed Browning 50s in every role imaginable: anti-aircraft, anti-personnel, suppression, even to destroy structures. When kamikaze pilots dived toward the fleet, it was the 50s that cut them from the sky in blazing arcs of tracer fire. The Japanese infantry below, watching their airmen fall to the sea under the storm of those heavy rounds, began to feel the futility of resistance. One survivor later told an interviewer, "We believed in courage, but courage cannot stop thunder." The American strategists understood the morale effect. Psychological warfare units collected testimonies and analyzed the influence of sound on enemy behavior. One report from the Office of Naval Intelligence stated, "The auditory intimidation produced by the M2 heavy machine gun exceeds its mechanical efficiency. Enemy soldiers exhibit signs of paralysis under sustained fire, hesitation, delayed reaction, and loss of command cohesion." In other words, the sound broke them before the bullets did. Yet amid all this terror, there were moments of grim respect. Some Japanese veterans, years after the war, spoke of the Browning 50 with awe rather than hatred. They called it the voice of the new age of war, admitting that its design represented a future where machines would overpower spirit. At the same time, American veterans who had fired it spoke with the same haunted reverence. They described the weapon's voice as if it were alive, a mechanical beast with moods and tempers, capable of both protecting and consuming its masters. Private Harold Mason, who served as a tail gunner on a B-17, put it this way: "When you fired the 50s, it was like commanding thunder. But after a while, you stopped feeling like it was you doing the killing. It was the gun. You were just there to hold it steady." That detachment, the blurring line between man and machine, was one of the most chilling evolutions of the Pacific War. The Browning 50 had not only shaped the outcome of battles, it had reshaped the psychology of those who fought them. By the summer of 1945, as the Americans closed in on Japan's home islands, the fear of the gun had become legend. In whispered tones, captured soldiers warned their interrogators, "If the thunder speaks, we die." The war was nearing its end, but the sound of the Browning would echo far beyond the beaches and jungles of the Pacific. It had become the soundtrack of modern warfare, a sound that, once heard, could never be forgotten. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific was a graveyard of ships, aircraft, and memories. Across the islands once soaked in blood, the echoes of war lingered in the wind, faint, almost ghostly. But for those who had lived through it, the memory of certain sounds never faded. The heavy, rolling thunder of the Browning 50 caliber was one of them. In the years that followed, military historians and psychologists tried to understand the weapon's impact, not only in terms of casualties and tactics, but in the invisible realm of perception and emotion. The 50 caliber had done more than pierce armor. It had pierced the human mind. At war's end, American ordnance officers surveyed the remains of Japanese defenses from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. They found machine gun nests shattered, concrete bunkers cracked, trees split clean by the half-inch bullets. But more striking were the testimonies from the survivors, both American and Japanese, that spoke not of wounds or losses, but of sound. Lieutenant Robert Eldridge, who served with the U.S. Marine Corps' 5th Division, recalled in an interview from 1947, "We didn't realize it then, but the noise was part of our power. It wasn't just what the bullets did, it was what the sound promised. Every time those guns opened up, it meant the fight was already over." In Japan, demobilized soldiers returned home carrying their own memories. The hum of insects in the jungle suddenly turning into the deafening crack of American fire. The way the ground trembled, as if the earth itself recoiled from the 50's fury. For many, that sound became the war's defining echo, a reminder that their courage had met something beyond human endurance. In 1946, a Tokyo newspaper published a serialized column titled "Voices of the Battlefield." One anonymous veteran wrote, "I remember the thunder. It was not natural. It sounded as if the sky had anger. We called it the demon's laughter. Even in dreams, I still hear it." Psychologists studying post-war trauma among Japanese veterans noted a pattern of auditory flashbacks. Memories triggered by heavy rain, distant thunder, even the sound of industrial machinery. The 50 caliber had become more than a weapon. It had become an imprint on the collective psyche of a generation. Meanwhile, the weapon itself refused to fade into history. The Browning M2 remained in service, unchanged, unchallenged, through Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, and beyond. Decades after its debut, the same sound echoed across deserts and mountains, familiar to new generations of soldiers who never set foot on Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima. It was, in many ways, eternal. On the decks of American aircraft carriers in Korea, Navy gunners fired their Brownings against enemy aircraft and ground positions. Korean civilians described the sound as metal rain. In Vietnam, U.S. helicopters carried door-mounted M2s that sprayed the jungle below. The same roar, the same power. Even modernized, the weapon retained its ancient voice. The rhythm of its fire, that deep mechanical heartbeat, remained instantly recognizable. By the late 20th century, historians began referring to the Browning 50 as the voice of American firepower. Its sound had become synonymous with dominance, endurance, and fear, a symbol that crossed generations. But beneath that symbol lay a quieter truth. The weapon's legend was built not only on its effectiveness, but on the psychological relationship it forged between humans and machines. Soldiers who used it spoke of a paradox. The same sound that gave them protection also haunted them. Marine gunner Richard Conway, who manned a 50 on Okinawa, reflected decades later, "You never forget the sound. It follows you. Every time there's a storm, I hear it again. The steady beat, like the world itself firing back." The same duality existed for the Japanese veterans. For them, the sound was a ghost, a spectral warning that still echoed in memory. When researchers from Kyoto University interviewed aging survivors in the 1970s, many still referred to the weapon by its wartime nickname, Kaminari no Kikanju, the thunder gun. "When I hear thunder," one man said softly, "I still feel the mountains shake." In this way, the Browning 50 caliber transcended the battlefield. It became a cultural and psychological artifact, a sonic relic of industrial war, where the boundary between human emotion and mechanical noise dissolved. The story of that sound is also the story of the 20th century itself, an age defined by the growing distance between the soldier and his enemy, between noise and silence, between fear and understanding. During the war, a Japanese officer once asked in disbelief, "What kind of gun is that?" He could not see the weapon. He could only hear it. The question became the title of 1,000 whispered memories, passed down through time. What kind of gun was it? It was the sound of inevitability, the sound of a new age of warfare, one ruled not by courage, but by technology, precision, and the sheer psychological weight of noise. As the camera of history pans across the silent battlefields, the black sands of Iwo Jima, the coral reefs of Tarawa, the caves of Okinawa, it is hard to imagine the chaos that once filled the air. Yet, if one listens closely, perhaps through the wind or the waves, there is still a faint echo, a low, steady rhythm, a thunder that never dies.